Now that we've learned how to use the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP functions, in this video we'll look at how to create and use pivot tables in Excel. We'll first look at how to format our data as a table, then how to create pivot tables and use fields in a pivot table to analyze data. And lastly, we'll see how to perform calculations in a pivot table. Having a worksheet full of informational data is all very well, but to really get some use out of it, we need to analyze it from different perspectives to find answers to questions related to the data. Now, we've already used features such as filters and formulas to draw mathematical and logical conclusions about our data. But not all questions can be answered easily using filters and formulas alone. In order to obtain usable and presentable insights into your data, you need something else, and that something else is pivot tables. Pivot tables provide a simple and quick way in spreadsheets to summarize and analyze data, to observe trends and patterns in your data, and to make comparisons of your data. A pivot table is dynamic, so as you change and add data to the original data set on which the pivot table is based, so the analysis and summary information changes too. A data analyst can use pivot tables to draw useful and relevant conclusions about and create insights into an organization's data in order to present those insights to interested parties within the company. Before you start to create a pivot table in Excel, it can be very helpful to first format your data as a table. The reason for this is not only to make it more organized and defined and to add table styles to your data, but primarily it makes it a lot easier when adding records to the data set. In the car sales worksheet, let's first select any cell within the data, and then on the Home tab in the Styles group, choose Format as Table. Then choose a style from the gallery. Note that Excel automatically knows the boundaries of our data range, but we can change this if we need to. And ensure you select My Table Has Headers if indeed it does. After you click OK and the data has been formatted as a table, note the filter drop-downs at the top of each column. These are automatically added when you format as a table. If we now scroll down to the bottom of the table and start adding another row of data for another vehicle, when you click Tab or Enter, note that it is automatically formatted and included as part of our table. Okay, now let's see how to create a basic pivot table and how to use fields to arrange data in a pivot table. Just before we do that, there are a few things you should use as a checklist to ensure your data is in a fit state to make a pivot table from. And these are: format your data as a table for best results. Ensure column headings are correct, and there is only one header row, as these column headings become the field names in a pivot table. Remove any blank rows and columns, and try to eliminate blank cells also. Ensure value fields are formatted as numbers and not text. Ensure date fields are formatted as dates and not text. In the worksheet, we can just select any cell in the table. Then, on the Insert tab, we click Pivot Table. Note that in the Select a Table or Range box, the table name, Table 1, is already entered for us. If we hadn't just formatted this data as a table, we would specify the cell range here instead. Under that, we need to decide whether we want to create the pivot table on a separate new blank worksheet or on this worksheet. A new worksheet is the default and is the most commonly used option. So, a new blank worksheet opens, displaying some basic pivot table instructions in the graphic on the left of the worksheet, and a pivot table fields pane on the right. You can rename the worksheet for the pivot table if you wish. To build the pivot table report, we need to add some fields from the top of the pivot table fields pane to one or more of the sections in the bottom part of the pane. For example, if we want to find out the total sales for each model of car, let's drag the manufacturer field to the rows section of the report, and then we'll drag the model field there too. But this isn't really from the top of the pivot table fields pane to one or more of the sections in the bottom part of the pane. For example, if we want to find out the total sales for each model of car, Let's drag the manufacturer field to the rows section of the report, and then we'll drag the model field there too. But this isn't really the way we want it to look, so we'll drag the manufacturer field to appear at the top of the rows section above the model, which makes more sense with our data. Next, we'll add the price field to the column section, but again, that really isn't the way we want to view the data. So we'll drag price to the values section instead, which makes a lot more sense and looks a lot better. Next, we'll add the unit sales field to values too. So now we can see both the individual price for each model and the number of unit sales of each model. Let's add the vehicle type field to columns, but that doesn't seem very useful, so let's remove that field, which we can do in two ways, either by using the drop-down menu, or if we undo that, we can also do it by simply dragging the field out of the columns section, either to the left over the worksheet or to the top over the fields list above. Let's now look at how to perform a simple calculation in a pivot table. If we look at the sum of price column in our pivot table, we can see that the figures are formatted as general. So first, let's change the format of these figures to US currency. This can be done by modifying the value field settings for the field in the relevant section of the pivot table fields pane. We'll format the field as US dollars and show no decimal places. Next, we'll add a calculated field from the Pivot Table Analyze tab using the Fields, Items, and Sets button. We want this field to calculate the total sales for each model by multiplying the price by the number of unit sales. When we create and add this formula, it gets added to the Pivot Table Fields pane as a field called Total Model Sales. And we can change the format to make it US dollars again. A new column called Sum of Total Model Sales has now appeared in the pivot table in our worksheet. In row 5, we can see that there have been over $360 million of sales of the Acura Integra model. And in row 7, we can see that there has been over $1 billion in sales of the Acura TL model. In this video, we learned how to format data as a table, how to create a pivot table, and use fields to analyze data in a pivot table, and how to perform calculations using pivot table data. In the next video, we'll look at some other features of pivot tables. In this video, we will listen to several data professionals discuss their experience using pivot tables to analyze data. What are your experiences using pivot tables to analyze data?
My experience using pivot tables in Excel is extensive. I can use them all the time. The thing to keep in mind is that you can sum, average, and count easily. You can set it to group by so people can choose what the parameters are at the top. It's great if you've got a couple of thousand records all the way up to whatever Excel can handle. So a pivot table is just a real simple way of manipulation without having to do any actual querying or development language.
I once had a huge e-commerce sales data. I need to analyze the KPIs, including gross merchandise volume and take rate. However, I can only generate limited insights if I stay at a high level. With pivot tables, I was able to group the data in terms of countries, type of stores, type of products, which enable me to view the data and analyze the key KPIs at different levels of granularity.
I use pivot tables, and we use pivot tables in our firm, especially during audits, to assist us and help us to kind of drill down on the data. Because what a pivot table does is it helps you to take a large set of data and whittle it down to something that's meaningful. So in the case of audits, a client might have $500,000 worth of maintenance and repair bills that are made up of 300 invoices. Well, we don't want to see every invoice for every dollar. We want to see the high dollar invoices. So we're going to use that pivot table to narrow it down to the invoices that actually are going to have the highest level of impact on the financial statement.
Much like Excel, pivot tables are a great way to understand your data quickly and effectively. Being able to just open up an Excel sheet, put it into a pivot table, drag and drop things in to get a sense of what the numbers look like, what the values are, really can help you get a good sense of the data in order to then start to build out something a little bit more robust. Being able to understand the fields, what they mean, what they look like, these are all things that can help you at the start of a project as you're looking to do your analysis.
Pivot tables are incredibly useful to get a quick view of your data and to look at multiple levels of your data in a very quick and clean way. It's just very, very easy to create a pivot table on a set of raw data, aggregate it by some level of interest, be it country, be it country the user's from, be it the year the user joined, or anything else, be it something related to time. It's really good for quickly seeing and understanding some of the more high-level summaries that are hidden within your data.
Now that we've learned how to create and use pivot tables in Excel, in this video we'll look at some other features that we can use with pivot tables, including recommended pivot tables, filters, slicers, and timelines. First, let's look at recommended pivot tables, which isn't exactly a feature as such. It's really more of a list of suggested different combinations of data that could be used when creating a pivot table. These recommendations are based on the data we select in the worksheet, and they are a great way to get started creating pivot tables if you don't have much experience with them yet. For example, in the Vehicle Toy Sales worksheet, if we select column B, which contains data about the quantity of items ordered, when we choose recommended pivot tables from the Insert tab, then we are presented with a list of potential data combinations related to the order quantity information. However, if we select column F, which contains order size information, then the recommended pivot table list changes to reflect that data. And if we select column E, which contains sales information, then the pivot tables recommended are related to sales data. Let's select the third one down, which is the sum of sales by territory, because that sounds like something we could get some useful insight from by presenting it in a pivot table. Note that the new worksheet is opened containing the recommended pivot table, and a new pane opens on the right called Pivot Table Fields. Let's rename the worksheet to something more meaningful. In the Pivot Table Fields pane, you can see that some fields have already been added to the rows and values areas. Although it's a recommended pivot table, we can still make it our own by adding more fields, for example. So let's add the product line item to the columns area using drag and drop. Now we have columns for each of the product lines in our pivot table, such as motorcycles, ships, and trains. In the pivot table, we can manually expand any field we want to view its contents. Here we can see that the order dates are located underneath the territory names in our pivot table. Note that this matches the order of the fields in the rows area of the Pivot Table Fields pane. We can manually collapse each of the fields too, but we also have the option of expanding all the fields at once and collapsing them all too. The next feature we will delve into is pivot table filtering. Pivot table filters work in much the same way as the standard filters we used earlier in the course. Note that we already have some inbuilt filtering in this pivot table. For example, the rows label header is a filter, and we can filter on any of the listed territories, such as Japan. Just like standard filters, it's very simple to clear a filter in a pivot table. We also have a column labels filter, allowing us to filter on any of the product line items in this pivot table. For example, we could show data only for the trains product. We also have the option of adding the product line field as a standard filter instead of a column heading by dragging it to the filters area in the pivot table fields pane. And we can then use it as a standard filter as we have done earlier in this course. The filter also allows us to select multiple filter items, but because it's now being used as a standard filter rather than a column header, we can't see the split of the information on these two product lines. We just see a combined total. When we had the filter as a column header, the information on each product line was presented separately in each column. Let's display all the field totals again, and we'll drag the product line field back to the columns area where it was previously, so we can see the split of our different product lines in the pivot table. The next pivot table feature we will look at are slicers. Slicers are essentially on-screen graphical filter objects that enable you to filter your data using buttons. Slicers make it easy to perform quick filtering of your pivot table data, and they also display the current filter state, making it easier for you to know and see what data is currently being shown and which is being hidden by the filter. For example, if we remove the product line field from the pivot table by dragging it out of the pivot table fields pane, and then from the pivot table Analyze tab, we click Insert Slicer and then choose the territory field as our slicer, we can see that the slicer can be freely moved around anywhere on the worksheet, and it contains buttons for each of the territory names, such as EMEA, North America, and Japan. We can also select the Multi-Select button to filter on multiple territories if we wish. We can click the Clear Filter button to clear all the slicer filters. Let's add another slicer to our worksheet for the product line field. However, be sure to select a cell in the pivot table first, because if you don't, then the Insert Slicer button won't work. Note that slicers can also be added from the Filters group on the Insert tab, as well as from the Pivot Table Analyze tab. We'll select the product line field this time for our slicer and drag it near the top of the worksheet. As before, we can select only one slicer item, or we can turn on multi-select and choose several items to filter on in the slicer. Then let's clear the slicer filters. And now let's filter using both slicers. Note that when you use multi-select filtering, when you select an item, you are in fact filtering it out. That is, you are defining which items will not be displayed in the pivot table. This is the opposite behavior to when you were selecting single items in a slicer. So now we are displaying only classic cars, trains, and trucks and buses products for the EMEA and North America territories. Now let's clear those slicer filters and put the product line field back in the columns area of the pivot table, so it's ready for the next feature we will explore. And let's move these slicers out of the way further down the worksheet. The last useful feature for pivot tables we are going to look at is timelines. A timeline is another type of filter tool that enables you to filter specifically on date-related data in your pivot table. This is a much quicker and more effective way of dynamically filtering by date rather than having to create and adjust filters on your date columns. We can add a timeline for our pivot table either from the Pivot Table Analyze tab or from the Insert tab. Again, ensure you select any cell in the pivot table first. We'll select the Order Date field as our timeline filter. Then we can drag it up the worksheet and enlarge it. The default for this timeline is to display data by month, but you can also filter by days or by quarters. You can select a single quarter or you can select a range of quarters. In this case, we'll select 12 months between Q3 of 2003 and Q2 of 2004. You can use the Clear Filter button to clear a timeline filter. You can also filter by years. For example, here we have selected 2003 only. And you can combine slicers and timelines as filters in a pivot table. For example, here we can filter the slicers to display only data for trains in the EMEA and North America territories and only in the year 2003. And if we filter on the year 2004 instead, you'll see that there is no data being displayed, meaning that there were no sales of train products in 2004 in either the EMEA or the North American territories. Timelines and slicers have their own tabs in the ribbon when you select them, and their properties can be modified to change how they look and how they work. For example, let's change this timeline to a light green shade. And let's change this slicer to a nice orange color. And lastly, to remove a timeline or slicer, you can either select it and press the Delete key, or right-click it and choose Cut. In this video, we learned about some of the other features in Excel that we can use with pivot tables, namely recommended pivot tables, filters, slicers, and timelines. you.